let me welcome you all to, we're calling this the Europe panel, but that's partly because because we're sort of juggling time zones, we've organized really a set of regional rather than thematic panels. And that's really regional in terms of where people are based. So although we're calling this the Europe panel, our three panelists range much more broadly than that. Damian Tambini from the LSE, a distinguished policy fellow in the Department of Media and Communications, ranges across cyberspace and the digital. And that's been a kind of a major theme already today of the way in which the new technology is transforming the nature of media and sort of deconstructing the old business model of the media as well. We have Anne Gallagher, a very distinguished international lawyer, originally from Australia, served around the world and is now Director General of the Commonwealth Foundation. So she's based in Europe now, but her interests and remit are Commonwealth-wide. And to really focus more specifically on Europe itself, we're delighted to have James Wilson, who's the publisher of the EU Political Report, based in Brussels, a veteran correspondent whose work ranges across Europe and is a board director of the Brussels Press Club. So what I'm going to do is we're going to follow the format that we've been pursuing in the panel so far. I'm going to ask the three panelists really just to introduce themselves for 5 minutes and say a little bit about their own interests, and what they think the major issues are from their perspective in terms of the issue of media freedom and the press. And I'm going to start, and we'll take the speakers as they appear on the program. So I'll start by asking Damian to say a few words.
Very nice to meet you all, and thank you very much for the invitation. I will introduce myself, and I don't know if you want to do introductions first and then our pitches, as it were. My name is Damian Tambini. I'm based at the London School of Economics. I also have affiliations at Oxford, and I'm speaking to you from Oxford, where I live. In this context, I'm also one of the advisors, external advisor to the International Bar Association's panel on media freedom. I'm a member of the Council of Europe expert group on media reform currently, and have served on various Council of Europe expert groups. And in this context, I should also mention that I've completed and I'm about to publish a book with the title Media Freedom. So I'm been deeply involved in the theory of all of this, and I will try and avoid going too deeply into the details of all of that. But should we do introductions first? And then
why don't we do that? So at a sort of similar length. Anne, please.
Yeah, okay. I think you did a fine job, Philip, of introducing me. So I've been at I'll just add a little bit, I've been at the Commonwealth now for a bit over a year, and my background, and I can go into that sort of during the context of my remarks, but my background has been an intergovernmental one, most of my career with the United Nations, working on issues around human rights.
Thank you very much, James. James, over to you.
Oh, sorry, yes. James Wilson. I'm based in Brussels, where I've lived for the last 25 years or so. Prior to that, I was in Hong Kong, So I hope we can have some discussion a bit later on about the changes which I've seen in media freedom within my lifetime, and especially in recent months there. I would like to talk, when we get round to speaking, about some of the main associations that represent journalists' interests, one of which I belong to. And I've written about media freedom a fair bit. I've also defended and campaigned for journalists who've been in prison in different countries, different jurisdictions, sometimes successfully, I'm pleased to say. And I've got 2 or 3 pointers for the future, which I think would be interesting to talk about. I can either raise my sort of questions when I start or leave them to the end, as you like, Philip.
Okay, thank you very much. And yes, there is a subject which has run through this conference already, like lettering in a stick of seaside rock, and that is China. So your Hong Kong experience will be of great value, I think, James. Thank you all very much. So we've done the introductions. Now for what Damian calls the pitch, and do set out a few issues that you think we should.
Okay. When I received the invitation, I was wondering whether I should attempt a survey of current problems of media freedom. And I think we've come up with a predictable list. And we might focus on Hungary and Poland, the 2011 Hungary law, the ensuing struggle with the European Union attempting to impose rule of law obligations and protect fundamental European values, and in general the rise of populism, which is a direct challenge to the underlying democratic values of media freedom. We might look at fake news. We might look at the response to fake news laws. But I think what I want to do is just argue that there's underlying a lot of the things that we see as evidence of the crisis of media freedom. There are some big structural changes that we really need to understand in order to develop a smarter response. Obviously, they have to do with the ability of the media, which is facing a structural crisis of revenues, to defend itself, and I mean directly in terms of affording the legal representation and lobbying and all of the things which have carved out an autonomous space for the media in Europe, but also defending itself in terms of lobbying for a new position for quality journalism in what I would see as a quite radically different new structural position for journalism and news, given the rate of digital change. So I want to argue as well that the difficulty of responding to that crisis has a great deal to do with a problem of definition. There's a lot of discussion about media freedom. Today's no exception. But we need to take a couple of steps back and ask the prior question about whether we in fact agree what are the media and what freedom is. There are some pretty fundamental questions. Of course, whether social media should be considered media, and whether they should benefit from the privileges that go with that designation and the duties that go along with it too. So I welcome the current global interest in media freedom, but I would argue that there is actually, you could even argue that one of the biggest threats to media freedom is the inability of democracies and the inability of international organizations to agree what it means. And I would say globally, the biggest schism and the most urgent schism to address is that between the emerging global human rights approach to media freedom. And I would say General Comment 34 of the UN Human Rights Council is an example of that. And I would say that there's enough agreement between the UN view and the Council of Europe view to say that there's an emerging, consistent, coherent theory of media freedom within the international human rights community. But there is a schism between that and what I see as the US First Amendment position. And we could go into details about the problems with that. But I think in my book, what I argue is that the international human rights approach is what you might call a positive approach. So there's a positive role for the state in encouraging media freedom, including by constraint of private power. Whereas the First Amendment approach is a negative rights approach, which tends to be based mainly on restriction of state control of the media. And I think these sound like very theoretical and abstract problems, but when it comes to the most pressing questions that we face, it actually creates a lot of difficulty in agreeing what is an attack on media freedom by policymakers, and what is in effect an attempt to update a media system in order that it protects democracy. So I'll just give in closing just a few examples. So we're having policy debates around Europe at the moment about regulation of social media. So the European Union is discussing the Digital Services Act. And at the UK level, we will have, the government says this side of Christmas, detailed proposals for a online harms bill, which will effectively introduce a licensing regime for social media. Now that's something which, if you define social media as media, you might say is a threat to media freedom. Of course, the social media companies themselves, which adopt a US fundamental negative rights position, tend to take a different view. They say they are not media. And there are a number of regulatory and policy questions which flow from that. But I think as a result of differences between the European and US approach, you may see a lot of disagreement among democracies about how to resolve this fundamental challenge they face. The democratic crisis and the democratic malaise we are faced with around populism, around lying in politics, around fakery, disinformation, which of course has a national security dimension given doctrines of information warfare. The ability of countries and democracies to respond to that will depend on coming up with new international standards and agreeing new principles. Council of Europe is very much involved in that work. It also involves things like updating liability for press and journalism, self-regulation, and things like prominence. How do you come up with appropriate frameworks for deciding what is prominent? For example, the Journalism Trust Initiative is coming up with new standards for trusted news. All of these new, very innovative and very promising proposals come with dangers for media freedom, come with dangers of soft censorship, come with dangers of reciprocities between the new internet gatekeepers and states. I guess my pitch, and just to flag that we're doing some of this work within the Council of Europe, is that we need some way of understanding holistically that process of change and what I call the procedural dimension of policymaking. How can you have processes of system reform which are not subject to system capture, both by private interests and also by the state. When it comes to making a new deal with internet platforms, that handshake between Zuckerberg and Trump, that handshake between Zuckerberg and Modi, how do you ensure that is done in a way which is cross-party, which engages civil society, and which does not threaten democracy itself? I think they're the bigger challenges which we need to think through as we think through the challenges in the future, rather than just the challenges in the here and now. Thank you.
Thank you, Damian. These are all hugely important issues, and you won't be surprised to know that they echo themes that have been touched upon in earlier sessions. And indeed, one speaker put it very nicely in terms of the social media and the digital media. He said he compared the situation now to being like the early days of motoring, that suddenly, people realize that there need to be rules of the road, and there are going to be rules of the road. And the question is what they are and how we shape them in an acceptable way. So many of the things that you touch upon, I'd like to come back to. But let me then next turn to Anne and to ask her to set out some issues in a similar way. Anne, you're muted.
Sorry. You'd think that by now, after all this Zooming, that wouldn't happen. Okay, so thanks very much, Philip. I'll try and, there was just so much interesting in what was just said. So I feel like just going completely in that direction. But I'll try and set out a couple of things just to begin. So as I said in the introduction, I think I'm coming at this from a bit of an angle, a different angle, in the sense that as an international lawyer, I've seen firsthand, I think, the critical link between media freedom and that larger idea of human rights. This idea that without freedom of opinion and expression, without media freedom as a core element of that larger right, then pretty much everything else is at risk. And this idea, as was mentioned before, has really been born out of the intergovernmental system. And that's something I want to go back to when we start talking about the Commonwealth and pushing the Commonwealth to step up in this space. So it was the UN and the other intergovernmental organisations, especially in Europe, that have played such an important role in elevating freedom of expression to the status of a universally recognised right. They've really done the hard work of socialising us all to the idea that this right, including the component of media freedom, is essential to the flourishing of a democratic society and a basic condition for development. And I think that obviously the Commonwealth didn't lead that pack, but we shouldn't forget, I think it's so important for us to keep reminding ourselves and keep reminding Commonwealth member states and institutions that through the Charter, the Commonwealth has affirmed loudly and clearly the right of every citizen to freedom of opinion and expression, and critically the obligation that goes with that, the obligation of states to upholding what I think the Charter says, peaceful and open dialogue and the free flow of information, including through a free and responsible media. We do need to unpack what that actually means, but these are the words of Commonwealth member states. So it is an active taking on of a responsibility. There's not that negative right that was mentioned before. So that's something that we do have and that we can really grab hold of and run with. But we also know, and I think just picking up from what's been said this morning and in the past sessions, that assaults on media freedom are just becoming more commonplace and more severe right across the world, right across the Commonwealth. And it's important to keep in mind what we're seeing with that. It's not in isolation. We're seeing this accompanying, feeding and being fed by this general erosion of democratic culture and diminished governmental accountability across the board. So, okay, what's my pitch? So my informal litmus test of how media freedom is doing in a country, in a society, is to look at the capacity of the society to understand what's going on. And I think that that's where we can see the failure in the Commonwealth, right across the world. So we can, we can look at Europe, and I think this panel is focusing on Europe and Canada, and in many respects then maybe we have the good end of the stick. We can point to robust legal protections of press freedom in Canada and across Europe. We can also note adherence, good adherence to the international and regional legal instruments that protect and uphold freedom of opinion and expression. I think it's 14 of the 20 top ranking countries in the World Press Freedom Index are European. Canada also makes the list. But performance of our other Commonwealth states that come within the geographical range of this panel, it's pretty uneven. We've got, I think, the UK at Cyprus almost gets in at 27, but the UK takes, I think, the 35th spot. And then we have Malta ranking 81 out of 180 countries, a precipitous decline in its international standing over just a couple of years. And I think that is something that we need to talk about whether that's an outlier or whether that's an indicator of a more worrying trend in this part of the world. So I did want to talk, I think it's useful for us to talk a little bit about the pandemic, about how the pandemic has prompted and been used to justify a massive increase in state power. And if we think about freedom of expression as an antidote to state power, it's not surprising then that we've seen a curtailment of that right coming along with the new exercise of power. Access to information being held by public authorities being limited, reporting on public health data being compromised, sharing of information online and offline being restricted. And of course, some of this might be necessary, but those of us who've seen the long-lasting impact of, for example, the post-2001 restrictions on media that came after or during the war on terror. That's our recent history. We're still living it, and we'd do well to remember it. So I'll just finish up with a very quick observation on the Commonwealth, that this is the institution, this is the family, the idea that actually brings us together, that you've, the umbrella that you've brought us all under here today, Philip. And I don't think I'm alone in my belief that the Commonwealth really stands, if it wishes, on the edge of a new era, that this particular moment in history is delivering the Commonwealth a once in a generation opportunity to reinvent itself. And I think that there's a real chance that this issue, freedom of opinion and expression, media freedom, a core value of the Commonwealth Charter, could be the launch pad for that reinvention. By taking up the cause of media freedom, the Commonwealth could perhaps do more through this to reaffirm its role as a moral leader, as a champion of human rights and democracy. So perhaps that's something we could explore in a little bit more detail. I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you. And ending on an optimistic note, which we'll return to, no doubt. James.
Yeah, I'd like to take up immediately that last point that Anne made and remind people that actually in the top 10 countries for media freedom, according to the index, which is produced by Reporters Without Frontiers, you have 2 Commonwealth countries. Top of the list at position 6 is Jamaica. Mm-hmm. And in 9th place is New Zealand. So there are members of the Commonwealth who are doing things extremely well. And maybe, as Anne has suggested, there's something that could be built on there, sharing across the members of the Commonwealth, and to make this into a leadership issue. What I'd like to do is maybe look at some statistics. And again, Anne referred to this. First question really is journalism the world's riskiest profession? Now, I've often said to my friends that we're at the bottom of the food chain. And I think it shows in terms of the way in which journalists are treated. In the most recent statistics produced by Reporters Without Frontiers, there were 80 journalists were killed in 2018, 348 in prison, and 60 being held hostage. So when it comes to looking after freedom, for journalists at the sharp end, it's a very basic survival question. And a key thing for us is our network, the press associations, the journalists' unions, and getting some kind of recognition or support, so that when you have an issue where you need help, it's available. Because what tends to happen is that the murders or the imprisonments are forgotten. It's yesterday's news very quickly. So, for example, and here I think it's worth saying that as far as Europe, the definition of Europe is concerned, the European Federation of Journalists considers Russia, Ukraine, and Turkey to come under their definition of Europe. Well, let's not forget that the Washington Post correspondent, Jamal Khashoggi, was murdered in Istanbul very recently in shocking circumstances, as was the investigative Slovakian journalist Jan Kuciak and his fiancée in 2018. And of course, the Maltese journalist Daphne Caruana Galizia, who was blown up in a car bomb. Now, all of these happened in Europe. We're meant to be at the leading edge of media freedom. It's not happening. There are some very serious problems. Yes, you do have a lot of murders in places like Afghanistan, Syria, Mexico, United States also, but Europe does not have a good record. In terms of imprisoning journalists, China is the worst offender, followed by Iran, Saudi Arabia, Egypt, and Turkey. What China doesn't accept is, I think, what we in the West consider the crucial role of journalists to deliver facts and truthful reporting to enable citizens to make informed choices and decisions about how to exercise their democratic rights. In a command and control society, it's just not accepted. So another terrible example of totalitarianism is Belarus. And I'll come on to this to give some figures for Belarus in a minute. But I believe fundamentally that false news, fake news, or lies are not an alternative point of view. It's a deliberate deceit which is designed to cause harm or to promote somebody's agenda at the expense of somebody else. So I think as a society, and the Commonwealth, for example, as a group, we need to honor more and respect the principles of our journalists in their fight for media freedom and make greater efforts to protect them. Now, next week, the European Parliament is actually debating and adopting a resolution on media freedom. I don't know if anything's going to happen about that, but one of the ideas which they came up recently with was to have a journalism prize, which is a Daphne Galizia Prize for European journalists. I don't know if such a thing exists in the Commonwealth. Maybe it's worth considering, but I believe we do need to do more to show that we honor and respect our journalists at the bottom of the food chain. I'd just like to mention some of the statistics in Belarus, which are catastrophic. So they had the so-called election on 9th of August for the president. And since then, the local association for journalists has registered 400 violations of journalists' rights. 320 journalists have been arrested for just doing their job. You know, it's not a crime. Journalism is not a crime. And about 1 in 3 of those detained suffered from violence or torture. And there are recorded cases of these. But on a positive note, through the most dreadful adversity, a little glimmer of hope was brought to my attention. The Belarusian opposition includes some very intelligent and highly educated young people who are brilliant software programmers. And what they've done is they've come up with a very sophisticated face recognition technology, which enables them to take footage from mobile phones or some of the blog TV films that have been taken of the police and the Secret Service. And they've started developing files, ID files, showing the names, addresses, rank, serial number, families of all of the officers that they've managed to capture on film, beating up young girls and causing distress to defenseless, peaceful protesters. So on that note, I'd just like to throw open 3 questions. The first question is, look, as in Belarus, today, everybody has the technology. Everyone's got a smartphone virtually, and they have the technology to film and report events. Do we have a responsibility as citizens to expose the truth? Someone did recently in Nigeria with pretty disastrous effects. And can media outlets protect the citizens if they do? That's the first question. The second question, which is going through the parliament in France at the moment, which is, should journalists have the right to film and photograph police operations? I don't know the answer to that. I'm throwing that out. And the last one, which I hinted at before, and it was in deference to Anne's idea of a Commonwealth initiative. It's what can we do to support free journalism more than we do today? So can we, for example, have a Commonwealth equivalent of the Galicia Prize to raise awareness of the work that journalists do? And I'll end it there with those 3 questions. I won't be offended if you follow up other questions, but I just throw those out in case they could spark some debate.
No, well, I'd like to come back to them actually, and I'd just say at this point, there's a huge amount of experience in this virtual seminar room in the media. So as always, please use chat to raise questions as they occur to you, and I'll feed them into the discussion. But I really want to take, I mean, I'll sort of maybe send those questions back in a slightly different form. But listening to James, a kind of a remark, an idea kind of occurs to me, and I hope it doesn't sound too flippant, because it brings together quite a lot of what's been said over the course of the day. That one could think about this issue of media freedom, not in human rights terms or in political terms, but in ecological terms, the journalists as an endangered species. And, you know, James is sort of, I mean, the kind of the really brutal part that it's a bloody dangerous profession. Especially in particular parts of the world, in particular parts of the Commonwealth, and we've heard this throughout the day. You know, leading distinguished journalists from India and Pakistan who've had good reason to fear for their safety. But it's broader than that. It's much broader than that. And again, we've heard this throughout the day, that the kind of the business model which has sustained journalism is starting to disappear. The kind of ethical codes or professional codes of the journalists, you know, again, some panelists from Africa were complaining in the previous session, you know, you get all of this experience over a lifetime, and then a bank robbery happens and some bloke with a mobile phone is able to cover it perfectly adequately and make the news, make the headlines. It's James was sort of saying that in a way. It's everyone becomes a journalist. So in a sense, are we engaged in a sort of slightly Luddite project of trying to preserve something which one way or another is disappearing? And do we have to kind of accept that there will be a kind of completely new kind of information ecology? And what we've come to regard as the sort of journalist will begin to disappear. Damian, what do you think of that?
I was just wondering if you were slightly posing a false opposition there. But
okay.
I mean, I think the answer is both. You know, I mean, journalism is transforming. We have to understand it as a kind of a systemic shift, and we also have to understand. I mean, I agree with James about the crisis, and you know the problems of protection of journalists, all of these things which have been there for some time. But the peculiar thing about the current stage in terms of imprisonment of journalists and attacks on journalists is that they seem to be increasing to a certain extent and in certain places, and that's partly to do with a kind of decline of trust and decline of confidence really in the international model of democracy, rule of law, and human rights, which prevailed in this region that we're discussing. But we don't want to get involved in too much golden ageism, but I do think we need to try and unpack that. You say that, think about it ecologically. I think that's right. I think that's a good metaphor. But if we look back, and this is kind of the theory I develop in the book, if we look back at the previous environment in which journalism emerged and in which it was able to become what Habermas calls an autonomous, self-regulating system with its own ethics, with its own responsibility. And that was reflected in the constitutional settlement and in theories of freedom of expression, which is that media freedom exists in order to achieve the instrumental ends of democracy and truth, and brings them together. This is the theory of liberal democracy and the theory of liberal democratic constitutions explicitly. But we had a number of rules which reinforced that. We had public broadcasting in Europe, the mixed broadcasting system, subsidies, free spectrum, protections from liability. This was a social compact, highly complex. It was not one single decision. It created an autonomous system. Somehow, in a completely radically changed technological system, we need to rebuild something which will be a bit like that, in the sense that it is a communication system which supports democracy, but it will be very different because the technology is different. It permits targeting of messages. It permits data-driven systems. The economic framework works differently in terms of multi-sided markets. So I think what in terms of the thinking through what can be done here, I think there's a real need to create policymaking capacity and prevent capture of that process and prevent loss of trust in the system. What is happening now is that social media platforms are moderating. They're saying, we define this as good journalism. We will, in a way that's not transparent or understood, be promoting this thing called good journalism. We will be moderating. We will make certain things prominent. There will be a deal that we will strike with Parliament and government to make certain things prominent and get rid of things that we define as terrorism, hate speech, disinformation, misinformation. The UK government has a disinformation program designed to do that. This will not be trusted. This will not be trusted by citizens in democracies because it's just a censorship blob. It's where I call it in the book, censorship by the blob. So we're coming up with this new complex co-regulatory framework, which will not be trusted. And we need to think about processes for involving civil society, involving cross-party organizations, which will generate legitimacy and trust in that kind of this new institutional settlement. My view at the moment is I'm not entirely convinced this is going to work. Because we're doing some work at the Council of Europe to try and think through these things. But in terms of what governments are doing and what parliaments are doing, we seem to be very much at the foothills.
And Anne, you kind of raise this idea of the Commonwealth maybe taking up this issue, but again, if you frame it in terms of just simply protecting journalists. If you were standing outside the next Commonwealth Heads of Government Summit with your little collecting tin that says protect journalists, I suspect that a number of leaders wouldn't dig very deeply into their pockets. How do you get heads of the Commonwealth states interested in this area? How do you persuade them that it's somehow in their interest to take this issue up?
Can I just intervene?
Yeah.
Briefly before. Let's not forget. I mentioned those three murders: Khashoggi, Galiatsa, and Kuciak. Let's not forget who was responsible for those murders. They were the leaders of Saudi Arabia, Slovakia, and I've forgotten the third country now, but it was the country's leadership. Malta, sorry, yeah. So in the case of Galicia, the prime minister was forced to resign. In the case of Slovakia, the leader of the country lost the next election because he was closely associated in the public's mind with the murder. And in the case of Saudi Arabia, well, the prince seems to have got away with it relatively unscathed. But it's the citizens, I think, that we need support from rather than the leaders of the governments.
Yeah, I mean, Anne, so political leaders have a fairly ambivalent relationship to journalists. Where would this initiative from the Commonwealth come from? Would it come from civil society? Would it come from political leaders?
Yeah, so a couple of comments, Philip. I think that the examples that were just used probably illustrate really well the link between media freedom and democratic culture and democratic institutions. Where the institutions are still strong, where the culture still has resonance within it, then attacks on journalists, for example, will not tend to go unpunished or unrecognized. So it's, for me, that's a reaffirmation of the importance of us not looking at this issue in isolation. I know that one of the previous panels, for example, one of the speakers linked the capture of the judiciary with the growing erosion of media freedom, because while the judiciary is not able to play its role as an independent arbiter of the rules, then it doesn't matter if the rules are very good. Look, I think we, I feel like I worked on human rights at the UN during what was truly the golden age. And it's really sobering to think that, or to realize, acknowledge that if we were to recreate this system of rights and freedoms that was set up in the 60s, 70s and 80s and kind of a little bit after that, it just would be impossible. The momentum for that kind of global standard setting for so many reasons is just not there. And what we have to do is desperately try and preserve what we have. There will be little pockets of progress, probably almost always in Europe, but we need to be very clear that pretty much everywhere outside the Council of Europe, it's a very negative environment. And new standard setting is, it's a great idea, but it's probably not going to happen, not in a way that is going to make a difference. We do need to look at what we have and look at how we can shore it up. We need to road test it for relevance, because all of the standards that do exist around freedom of opinion and expression and media freedom were developed long before this landscape came into being. So let's stress test that and see where the fault lines are and where the gaps are. Some of them have already been brought up, but I think a strong dose of reality. I feel that there are the political appetite for jumping into the middle of this is not terribly strong from leaders of Commonwealth countries or otherwise. Perhaps we can do something with Jamaica and New Zealand within the Commonwealth to highlight their leadership role and push them forward as examples of where it's necessary to go. We can maybe find some of these opportunities, but in the end, at least for so far as we can preserve democracies and the role of citizens in democracies, then it's very much about cultivating and supporting an informed citizenry and getting the citizens to play their role to participate in governance in meaningful ways and push their leaders towards where they absolutely have to go.
James, do you want to come in on that?
Yeah, I fully agree with Anne. One of my favorite quotations comes from the Washington Post, which has as its strapline, "Democracy dies in darkness." Well, the corollary to that is that it survives in the light. And I think that's, Anne's hit the nail on the head. We need to enlighten and empower the citizens who are supportive of democracy and get them to speak up for their newspapers and their institutions before they're exploited by dictators.
Damian, do you want to come in on this?
Well, I mean, I agree, and I can see where the sentiment's coming from. And I agree certainly that one of the key challenges is with public understanding and citizens that ultimately will protect those values of media freedom and also support new policy initiatives. And one of the issues, however, I think, is that with regards to social media, and I posed or almost posed a question to the panel in my opening remarks. If we're having a conversation about media freedom, let's just agree on the basics. Does media include Facebook? And if we're developing new approaches to media freedom, and I can see in the work of the International Bar Association's panel, in the UK Foreign Office led work, there's an attempt, if you like, to develop principles, declarations, pledges, which use the term media freedom, and we're really at the stage of needing to define what it is we mean. Standard setting, narrowly defined in terms of the post-war settlement, I agree, it's not realistic, but standards will be set, and they will be set by the platforms in some sort of a co-regulatory arrangement with individual states. And what we're seeing in Europe at the moment, just as we saw with the GDPR, which because it was only really Europe that was prepared to and able to take that on, it's becoming the default global standard for data protection. Whereas at the time it was being developed, it was seen as hopelessly radical and would never work. But I think we're seeing in Europe a new kind of policy settlement being worked through. It will take a long time. It's not just about moderation and content regulation on the platforms. It's about what they do for journalism. Do they make it prominent? Are they obliged by governments to make it prominent? Do they provide revenue in the form of data or money to support journalism? How is that done without compromising the independence of journalism? All of these, multiple, and the fiscal and tax settlement and the various forms of subsidies and levies, all of these questions will be resolved, not to speak of the competition framework and how that feeds into issues of independence of social media. Whether we like it or not, standards will be set. And my point is really that there's a role for opening up that process, ensuring civil society is involved, and also, if you like, modeling how you do media policy. And there are, that's where I think there are interesting examples in Europe of developing media policy in ways which are cross-party, which are trusted, which involve civil society, which have standards of transparency, so that the process of developing new rules and standards is not seen as a stitch up by the deep state, and is not seen as something which itself compromises media freedom and itself undermines trust in democracy. Because if half the population is getting tweets which are flagged, content which is promoted in ways they don't understand, they will trust this system much less.
I mean, you use this term trust, and it's come up a lot. And I suppose the question is, in a political environment where trust is increasingly in short supply, who has the moral authority to lay down these kind of rules and regulations? Is it the state? The state doesn't seem to be trusted very much. I mean, Damian, you use this phrase, civil society. What is civil society anymore? I mean, how does it coalesce? So where's this regulation going to? I mean, if someone is going to tell me I can't read something, my instinct is to object and say, who the hell are you to tell me that I can't see this, or I can't write this, or I can't do this?
I mean, that's why. I mean, if I may, that's why the overall settlement matters a great deal, because, for example, if a dominant platform that has 90% of the audience in a given market takes down some content, flags it, tags it, blocks it, or makes a particular segment of the population unable to access it, that's a problem if it's a dominant platform. It's not a problem if it's not a dominant platform, and if users can switch between platforms, and if they're interoperable, and you have data portability. So this is just as it was in the Second World War with the designing of broadcasting systems. There's an interplay between the kind of how you structure the overall market, mainly through competition law, and the behavioral rules. So, but if we're granting these kinds of monopolies, then we need to work out what the regulatory framework for that, and that has to be a social conversation. That's unrealistic. This is unrealistic in places that don't have the kind of political culture for that kind of involvement. But I was at a meeting of European regulators who are working through kind of online harms proposals just a couple of weeks ago, and I asked the same questions. How is the system going to be trusted? And their response was, well, parliaments have a key role, because part of this is about setting the legal framework in a way which is transparent. The Article 10 of the European Convention requires any restriction on freedom of expression to be prescribed by law, for the reason that you need a process, you need transparency, you need some sort of checks and balances on those restrictions. So Parliament has a key role. Existing news and journalism has a key role. Civil society organisations and citizens, of course, have a key role. But as I said before in my comments, I'm not entirely convinced that this project of updating those frameworks and rules and regulation is successful. It's very, very urgent.
Thank you. Anne, what would you like to add to?
Yeah, just to leapfrog onto or over those comments, I think that we somehow have to find a way of interrogating what these standards, which still do provide the general framework for how we understand freedom of expression, opinion expression, and media freedom, what they actually mean today. So the European standard about restrictions on freedom of expression, that probably meant something very different 20 years ago or 15 years ago than it does now, when we know that restrictions on freedom of expression can come in the form of buying up strategic media assets, rules that suppress, indirectly suppress freedom of speech, that, for example, around like libel laws. There's so much there. What does it mean now for this new media landscape? I also just wanted to pick up very quickly your point, Damian, on the role of parliaments, and again bringing the conversation back to the Commonwealth. That this is one of the most active and one of the more powerful of the Commonwealth associations, the Commonwealth Parliamentary Association. And it seems to be even more active. It seems to be reinvigorated under new leadership. What could the CPA be doing along with other Commonwealth institutions to really take this up in a serious way and to be part, not just of a conversation, but really to be part of a reorientation?
I'm conscious that time is passing, so I want to bring in some of the questions from the floor. And one that immediately caught my eyes from Kieran Hassan: what are the chances of vigilante journalism taking off in Europe? I like this phrase, Kieran.
Yeah, can you explain what it means? Because I'd be a bit worried that vigilante journalism is all the kind of journalism I don't like.
Exactly. Yeah. What do you mean by that, Kieran?
Yes, well, vigilante journalism is basically people being, there's another term within the social media realm, which probably Damian would have come across, which is called Slacktivism. So with social media campaigns, there's like, there's a kind of taking matters in your own hands and going out in the kind of for protest movements and taking it on your own hands, basically. So that is called vigilante journalism, in which basically nobody's listening to the official or the traditional media directives, like the anti-mask movements that we saw both in the United States as well as in some European cities, particularly in the case of COVID-19. And so this was particularly, this is a term which has actually birthed after social media has actually been has played a critical role in mass protest movements.
I still don't understand it though, like in terms of the use of the word vigilante. Maybe I'm missing something there.
Well, this is an academic term, basically. So it's just.
So I'm not supposed to understand it.
No, you are supposed to. I'm just trying to give a kind of relevance to reference to where it comes from.
We're surely just talking about.
It's basically, BBC is telling something else, and the traditional media platforms are telling everything that, just for face masks is the way forward. But people are going and they're not listening to any of the traditional media sources, so they're just going and using Facebook and all these social media platforms to generate a movement. Like we had the yellow jacket movement in France. So these kind of movements have been perpetuated by vigilante journalism. So everybody takes it matters in their own hands, basically. So
James,
it's not just one particular platform which is
let James pick up on it.
Yeah. I was just going to come in to say, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah. We're surely just talking about campaigning here.
Yeah, I think so.
But it's just campaigning. But there's a very fine line between campaigning and what I would call hybrid warfare, which has been instigated by hostile powers like China or Russia. It's very much in a hostile power's interest to sow dissent and civil disobedience in the United States and the UK by having people knock down statues in the name of this movement or that movement, and to run around Trafalgar Square with no masks on, beating up the police. But that, I wouldn't call it by any stretch of the imagination vigilante journalism. It's campaigning, and whether it is hostile campaigning, which is being used, as I say, as a hybrid warfare weapon or not, is something that needs to be examined.
So, and this kind of, I mean, this raises the whole issue of fake news and disinformation. And again, there's a lot of discussion about this at the moment. There's a very good seminar run by the Aspen Foundation a couple of days ago on this, and a group of experts who work in this area, and they say, okay, the moment governments try and combat disinformation campaigns, up pop the human rights lawyers saying we need to protect freedom of speech and freedom of expression. And again, we find ourselves, you know, in the not unfamiliar situation of chasing two laudable but apparently incompatible ends. Damian, do you want to?
Well, I mean, rightly so, up jump the human rights lawyers,
Yeah.
Because I think a lot of the ways that governments try and deal with that very real national security threat is, can I say it, somewhat naive, because what they tend to do is put themselves in untransparent ways in cahoots with the platforms and try and seek to retain discretion over who decides what is disinformation, so deliberate falsehoods, and what is misinformation, which is inadvertent untruths. So I think there's a real need to engage. I think there are mistakes being made, and the same big mistakes being made over and over again in different countries as they try and develop a policy response to this kind of what James called hybrid warfare. I would say that the response is the response is very often doesn't take into account the wider kind of systemic problem that is fake news. But I would mention as well that I mean, you mentioned the Commonwealth parliamentary organisations. You might want to take a look at what Damian Collins did when he was chair of the Select Committee on Fake News in the United Kingdom, which was that he organised a series of interparliamentary meetings. So the culture and media committees of other parliaments met, and they met a number of times in the US, in Ireland. I think I attended a meeting in Ireland about a year ago, and they reached a certain kind of momentum before Damian Collins was deposed, perhaps because he was making too much noise about problems of Facebook campaigning, which I think was unpopular with the government at the time. But that model of, for what is a global problem, issues of good practice, deep theoretical and legal and constitutional issues to work out, I think some value could be added by some sort of interparliamentary meeting, and that there is an existing model, and I don't quite know where it's gone, setting up what they call the Grand Committee in order to, for example, call Zuckerberg himself to testify to a parliamentary committee outside the United States, which he's done in Europe, but he hasn't done elsewhere.
Anne, would you like to come in and say something on this?
Yeah, no, I might just end up being a bit boring and repetitive by just asking about other ideas, I think more ideas perhaps like this about how we can really engage the Commonwealth, the member states, the Commonwealth institutions, Commonwealth civil society. How can we have this institution, it has a mandate to protect freedom of opinion and expression. It has a mandate to encourage the free flow of information. Like, how can it be really a player in this space, a player that uses its very particular convening power, it's the soft power that is so essential to the Commonwealth? How can this be channeled in such a way that these kinds of issues that we're talking about now can really be moved forward?
But I mean, just take an example from a question that Nicholas Watts has has posed in chat. I mean, Nicholas says, could the Commonwealth address media monopolists, e.g. Murdoch and Zuckerberg, to counter their active support for populism, Murdoch, or failure to control it, Zuckerberg? Well, I'd have thought that this was sort of way above the pay grade of the Commonwealth in a sense, in terms of what it can do. I mean, everyone is afraid of Murdoch and Zuckerberg. I mean, what is the Commonwealth going to do about that? Well, I mean, is there any way it could exert influence in something like that?
No, well, it's. I think it's, could the Commonwealth exert influence over China's encroachment of media in a number of Commonwealth countries? Yeah. Maybe that's also above the Commonwealth's pay grade, but maybe not. Can the Commonwealth perhaps play a role in celebrating those countries, situations, practices where we see real courage and real principle in protection of media freedom? Maybe that's a more strategic use of Commonwealth, this soft power that can sometimes be so much more effective than the hard version.
And I mean, just you mentioned China, and I promised that we'd go back to James on his sort of experience of Hong Kong, because it really has been a major recurring theme of today, Chinese influence. And I mean, someone who's been sitting in on most of these sessions, my PhD student, Richard Dromer, is starting to work on Chinese influence in West Africa and its impact on media freedom. What would you say that Chinese influence is, in terms of, is it actually empowering governments to be more repressive in this area? Is it giving them more freedom of movement? And what is the Chinese approach, James, to this area?
Well, it's classic totalitarian control. So it's command and control. I order, you do. And in terms of what Kiran was calling vigilante journalism, let me take you back.
It's a term that I borrowed, which came after.
Well, let me take you back to 2018 and the democracy protests in Hong Kong. I don't know if you remember, but some gangs of thugs attacked journalists and some of the protesters in an underground train and beat them up with iron bars. Now, this it's a classic way of dealing with journalists in a totalitarian regime. You beat them up and frighten them so that they don't cause you trouble anymore. And I have no proof, but I'm reasonably certain that these thugs were simply employed by the party faithful of the Chinese Communist Party to do their bidding. And it made the news, spontaneous support for China in Hong Kong. Complete rubbish. This was vigilante journalism at its very, very worst.
No, absolutely, James and Anne and Damian, and of course Philip, I totally endorse whatever you all have said. I'm not justifying vigilante journalism. I'm just saying how is because more recently, we've actually seen the erosion of states' capacity to regulate their European audiences. And that was evident also in the kind of yellow jackets campaign in France, and then of course so there's a kind of shift in the audience because of social media, kind of perception building based on social media platforms. that was just my understanding.
But I think, coming, Philip, to your question, the influence of China in the countries with which it's trading is malign. It's extremely bad, I would say. Coming from Belgium, one of my favorite artists is René Magritte, and a surrealist. I don't know if you remember his painting, Ceci n'est pas une pipe, and it's a painting of a pipe. Well, this is what the Chinese do. You know, they build a concentration camp in Xinjiang, and they say, this is a re-education center. It is not a concentration camp. No, the people are not in prison. They're simply being educated. And the danger is that this kind of propaganda behavior is being spread and multiplied in the countries where they're looking to curry favor. They're teaching other countries how to use propaganda as a weapon, in the same way that the Chinese have learnt this from the Russians, by the way.
If I can just jump in, that I think there is this kind of almost an inbuilt assumption that the media is going to, more media freedom is going to lead to more and better things. But perhaps the situation of the Uyghurs in China is a great example of where an ostensibly free global media has been pretty uninterested in something that under any kind of measure should be a story of the century. So yeah, I don't know where that leads us, but it's probably not to a very happy place about the state of the profession generally.
If we're trying to be sort of practical, I mean, there's a more practical and maybe manageable suggestion from Leo Kiss. Would a national level law that ensures social media companies are liable for the content shared on their platforms be easy to implement? And you're nodding your head.
Yeah, well, just because it's so the social media platforms, the major social media platforms are arguing against this, that they are, they're carriers. So like BT, like British Telecom, that this is their business model. And they're doing that so as to avoid exactly that. Because by having liability for, like a television station would have to do, or a radio station, or a print media outlet, they basically they can produce a business model that is just different to everything else, that looks exactly like, in many respects, like we would imagine a media outlet to be, but presents itself as a carrier with no responsibility whatsoever. So yeah, I think I agree with Leo that would be a massively quick fix. It would impose huge liability costs on social media companies. And this is the reason why it's being resisted with the full force of the vast and expensive legal teams that they've assembled to reject it.
Damian, do you agree with that?
Well, I mean, in a way, that's where the European debate is at the moment. I mean, it's on the one hand you have liability, on the other hand you have kind of mere conduit status, and the Digital Services Act and the Online Harms Bill are trying to work out what is the intermediate place of kind of hybrid liability, which is appropriate, given that the platforms are not able to monitor every piece of content that they host. And there's a conflict here between, if you conceive of them as media, the media freedom right of the platform, the need to have a platform that's independent and is not doing the bidding of the law and is open to freedom of expression, and the freedom of expression rights of the person that's posting that content. Where they've got to is a notion called a duty of care, which is, the metaphor there is a stadium owner that has a duty to take reasonable measures to protect from harm those people that use the stadium, and there's a variety of different approaches in the US and different European countries to how you might impose a duty of care, which is you would say, well, you have a duty to protect from harm. Those harms might include things like disinformation, but also other forms of hate speech, discrimination, etc., nasty stuff. But we don't want to oblige you or hold you fully liable for everything, and we don't want you to create a monitoring regime which would oblige you to take down huge amounts of material and deny those expression rights. So the debates now are really about how you design that duty of care type regime, and just change the incentives for the platforms so that they implement design measures, and that might be forms of moderation, some of it involving AI, some of it involving design, some of it involving labeling, flagging, consumer information, but how you can create an environment where you incentivize the reduction of harm overall. There are still people, particularly in the US, that say that any move away from complete near conduit status, protections from liability, which is basically the internet regime that goes back to the mid-90s. There are those that claim that any shift from that is a bad thing for freedom of expression. But I think in Europe, certainly the momentum is between some shift to a kind of a hybrid liability regime. But I think my previous kind of concerns and caveats, I think, still hold that the UK proposal, for example, involves Ofcom and Parliament devising a code of what is harmful content. But where does that discretion lie? Where do you have the boundary between, if you like, terrorism and freedom fighting, between campaigns and disinformation, between vigilante journalism and vigilantes? That discretion, who decides what is bad stuff, is what ultimately this is all about. And my argument would be that it is possible to have rules normally that apply to conduct rather than content, but those should be controlled not by the government of the day, certainly not by executive branch of government, but involving Parliament, civil society, and completely transparent in the criteria and in the execution of those criteria as well.
Thank you very much. I think this thanks to Kieran, this Charles Bronson image of vigilante journalism, I think is going to linger in our minds for many days to come. James, would you like to come in on this before we start to round up?
The only thing that drew my attention was the comment from Balasubramanian about literary prizes and films, etc. Soft power instruments to help develop a Commonwealth identity. And sort of coming full circle to my first remarks, which were introduced really by Anne's comments. Let's not forget we have some very good centres of excellence in the Commonwealth. Jamaica, New Zealand, and there are some countries which face some real problems and difficulties. Malta, Nigeria. Perhaps by sharing and helping one another, you can pull everybody up to a higher standard.
I think I'm tempted to kind of end on that very, very positive note. Not least because it leads us nicely to our final session in half an hour's time, because I think there's a great danger of these sorts of debates becoming, being framed in terms of North versus South, but actually, you know, not just Jamaica, but other Caribbean countries, many of them have a very good record in this area. And I think it's important that we learn from some of those examples of good practice elsewhere in the Commonwealth. And Yvette Rowe, who is going to be chairing that final session, is online. I think one or two of the other speakers for that session as well. So that's a very nice way of rounding up as we get to 5:30 London time. But thank you to all of our speakers, Anne and Damian and James. It's been a fantastic discussion. Thank you so much. And,
thanks, Philip. It's great.
And there's strangely some sort of positive ideas as well, and practical ideas. So that's great.
Thank you very much. It's really been a pleasure. It's been fascinating. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. And as with all of the other sessions, I'm so glad that we've recorded it and we'll be able to make this available in a little while. So please do stay with us. Final session, 6 o'clock London time. Have a little break, grab a coffee, and see you then.